referendum. I see the former Secretary of State has walked in, and I'd invite him, if he would, that there was a suggestion that somehow in my discussions in Brussels or elsewhere across the EU, I'd somehow been trying to undermine what he has been doing here, and I know that that has never been the case, and I invite him to intervene.
Yes, the right honourable gentleman has had many discussions with me in the last 2 years on Privy Council terms. And he has always been, I have to say this to the House, he has always been supportive of the country's interest in those discussions and indeed, in my understanding at least, of his conversations in the European Union.
I'm grateful for that intervention. I hope that deals with the suggestion that was made earlier. Can I go back to the facilitated customs arrangement, because it is a complicated arrangement. It is a two-tier arrangement. It involves different tariffs being charged at the border, and where you don't know what tariff should be taken, it involves the tariff being reimbursed later if it's the wrong tariff. There's no good the Secretary of State shaking his head, because that's what it says in paragraph 16a. It is complicated. It is no wonder business has said that they're sceptical about it, and it's no wonder the EU has said we don't think we can operate this. And it is no doubt for that reason that in paragraph 17a, what is said after a description of the arrangement is, however, the UK is not proposing that the EU applies the UK's tariffs and trade policy at its border for goods intended for the UK. There is no reading of that other than this is so complicated and bureaucratic. We know the EU are not going to be prepared to do it, and we're not going to ask them to. There is no other reading of that sentence. And therefore enter Monday's ERG Amendment 36. Subject to subsection 2, it shall be unlawful for Her Majesty's Revenue and Custom to account for any duty of customs or VAT or excise duty collected by HMRC to the government of a country or territory outside the United Kingdom unless arrangements have been entered into by Her Majesty's government and that government under which that government will account for Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs for the duties and taxes collected in that country on a reciprocal basis. In other words, it will be unlawful for us to collect and account for taxes at our borders unless other countries and territories, the EU 27, collect those tariffs and account to them to us. It will be unlawful. So this document, the White Paper, says we're not going to ask them to do it. This amendment says it will be unlawful if they don't. I invite the Secretary of State to intervene if he wants to quibble with that analysis. So by that amendment, the government has cut across its White Paper and inevitably made it more difficult to negotiate with the EU when the Secretary of State goes there tomorrow, because the EU has said this is not attractive to us, we don't want to do this. The White Paper says we won't ask you to, presumably as part of that negotiation, part of that discussion. That makes sense as a logical next move. The amendment, a wrecking amendment on Monday, makes it now unlawful for a sensible way to be found through that. I'll just make some further progress and I will give way. Mr. Speaker, this is not just a forensic challenge to the White Paper. It's fundamental. Absent a workable customs arrangement, the government has no answer to the question of how it will protect the manufacturing sector. Absent a workable customs arrangement, I will.
Right Honourable Gentleman. It isn't that forensic an analysis because it, and I suspect inadvertently rather than deliberately, but omits the key words of the White Paper which say the UK and the EU should agree a mechanism for the remittance of relevant tariff revenue. On the basis that this is likely to be the most robust approach, the UK proposes a tariff revenue formula. And that, of course, would be agreed as well. These are what the negotiations are for. It is set out plainly and squarely in the White Paper. I think the Right Honourable Gentleman knows that.
Well, I anticipated that challenge. I anticipated that sentence. But let's read that sentence. The UK and EU should agree a mechanism for the remittance of relevant tariff revenue. Will it be reciprocal or not? And if it's not reciprocal, it will be unlawful. And that is the difficulty. And if I'm sorry, no, just let me complete. If it was intended to be reciprocal, What is the point? What is the point of the sentence in reassuring the EU the UK is not proposing that the EU applies the UK tariffs and trade policy at its border for goods intended for the UK? So whatever the arrangement is, we know one thing about that arrangement. It is not going to involve the EU applying UK tariffs and trade policy at its border. Otherwise, what's the point of that qualification? I will give way.
I'm afraid he's making a false distinction here, but the key line in the paragraph is that the UK proposes a tariff revenue formula taking account of goods destined for the UK entering via the EU and goods destined for the EU entering via the UK. That is the most explicit statement of reciprocity. What more could he expect?
Well, I invite him to intervene just one more time. What is the point of the sentence that follows the one he just read out?
It is the exception to those arrangements, which is that we are not requiring the EU to levy the tariffs.
I'm really... this must be my failure to comprehend. There's an arrangement where tariffs are applied at the border and accounted for. The UK is not proposing that the EU applies the UK tariffs and trade policy at its border for goods intended for the UK. Well, how is it going to account for them? Mr. Speaker, I will give way.
I thank him for giving way. Does he share my suspicion that actually the whole proposals are made to be so complicated and difficult that the EU will find it very difficult to engage with that proposal, and as time goes by, we are actually crashing out without a deal, and that has always been the intention of the opposition?
Well, I'm grateful for that intervention, because that is why this is so... That is why this is so important. Unless there's a customs arrangement that works for manufacturing, then there isn't an arrangement that works for manufacturing. And the government last night voted down an amendment to say if we can't make something else work, we'll have a customs union. So there's nothing. If this doesn't work, there's nothing for manufacturing. Equally, if this doesn't work, there's nothing for Northern Ireland. Well, the Secretary of State shakes his head. If this doesn't work, what's the plan? If he wants to intervene, that's fine. If this plan doesn't work, if this facilitated customs arrangement doesn't work, isn't acceptable, the default, apparently, and according to the government, is not a customs union. What's the plan?
This model will work, and I just gently say to the right honourable friend, if he cared about it that much, why did the Labour Party go into the last election committed to having an independent trade policy, which can only mean leading the customs union?
I really don't like the if he cares about it that much. The suggestion that both of us not engaging in a difficult analysis of the White Paper with the interests of our country at heart is not fair. I care about it greatly because without the right arrangement, I genuinely believe that manufacturing in this country will be at risk. And I genuinely believe, having worked in Northern Ireland for 5 years, that without the right arrangements, a working arrangement, the solemn commitment to no hard border in Northern Ireland may not be kept. It is really serious. And point scoring about whether one is serious about it or not, it really doesn't help the Secretary of State and actually demeans him in his role, if I may say so. That isn't the way to conduct these debates. And it's not just the manufacturing sector. The White Paper's proposals on services reveal a huge black hole. Likewise, the proposals on rights and protections are simply inadequate. On social rights and employment rights and environmental rights, it is a non-regression approach. Non-regression. We won't necessarily keep up, we won't improve, they just won't necessarily get worse. And there's no clarity on the role of the European Court of Justice. Well, he says it ends, but it clearly doesn't end. The European Court has two different primary jurisdictions. The first is dispute settlement. The second is reference. That's the jurisdiction it's had, as he very well knows with his experience. The second of those is being preserved for everything in the Common Rule Book. The second of those is being preserved for everything in the Common Rule Book. That's why it's caused such difficulty with his own party. The jurisdiction of the court that exists on reference procedure is there for that wide range of issues, and he well knows it, and it will operate I should imagine in precisely the same way that it operates now. That is, there will be a reference to the court will decide the question before it, give a ruling in the interpretation, and that interpretation will be binding, because if it isn't, there's no point in the reference procedure. And if he's going to suggest that the reference to the court is for a ruling that isn't binding, I'd be very interested to hear it, because there's not much point referring something to a court for a ruling and then say, well, very nice, and we're going to apply it. The whole thing only works if the European Court can bind on it. The proposal for the labour mobility framework says things about business trips and tourism, but is completely silent on the terms under which EU citizens will be able to live and work in the UK and UK citizens in the EU. The grim reality, Mr. Speaker, is this. It's taken 2 years to get to this point, yet on analysis there's nothing there. Or more accurately, there's nothing that the warring Conservative Party can agree on. The Prime Minister's plan is exposed, unworkable and unacceptable to her own party, but she cannot move forward, as Monday night showed, and she cannot move backwards, as last night showed. That's not taking back control. That's no control, stalemate. But the country cannot keep paying the price for these divisions in the Conservative Party. We need a Brexit plan that can unite the country and protect jobs in the economy. And I'm sorry to say this white paper is not it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.